the borrowed life. The question seemed innocent enough. Steve Harvey had asked it countless times before, usually getting answers about grandparents with diabetes or relatives who'd had heart surgery. Has anyone in your family ever dealt with a serious illness? What 35-year-old Catherine Morrison said next would stop Family Feud dead in its tracks and reveal a medical crisis that had been hidden for months. Yes, Catherine said, her voice steady but carrying an undertone that made Steve pause. I've been on dialysis for 5 years. My mother gave me one of her kidneys, but my body is rejecting it. The words hung in the studio air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. But what came next would shatter everyone in that room. Catherine turned to look at her mother, Helen, who was standing beside her at the family podium with a look of complete confusion and growing horror. Mom doesn't know that part yet. I haven't told her the kidney is failing. The studio fell into the kind of silence that makes people question whether they're still breathing. Helen Morrison, 62 years old and the picture of maternal strength, stared at her daughter with an expression that cycled through disbelief, shock, and devastating comprehension. "Catherine," she whispered, her voice barely audible even with the microphone. "What do you mean failing?" It started as another Friday afternoon taping in Atlanta. The Morrison family from Portland faced off against the Chen family from Sacramento. Catherine Morrison was exactly the kind of contestant producers loved. Articulate, confident, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without overshadowing her teammates. She stood at the family podium next to her mother, Helen, and everything about their dynamic suggested a close, loving relationship. Helen kept patting Catherine's arm affectionately, whispering encouragement, celebrating every correct answer with the enthusiasm of a mother who was genuinely proud to be sharing this experience with her daughter. But there were subtle signs that something wasn't quite right, signs that only became obvious in retrospect. Catherine moved more slowly than someone her age should. She had a slight pallor that could have been attributed to nervousness, but seemed deeper than that. Most tellingly, she wore long sleeves despite the warm studio lights, and there was a careful way she positioned her left arm that suggested she was protecting something. During family introductions, Steve had been immediately charmed by their mother-daughter dynamic. "And who do we have here?" he had asked, approaching their podium with his trademark warmth. "I'm Helen Morrison, and this is my daughter, Catherine. We're from Portland, Oregon. Helen and Catherine, I love seeing mothers and daughters together. What's your secret? How do you two stay so close?" Helen had beamed with pride. "Catherine is my miracle baby. She's overcome every challenge life has thrown at her." Catherine had smiled, but Steve noticed something flicker across her expression, a shadow that didn't match the lightness of the moment.
"Every challenge?"
Steve had probed, sensing there was more to the story. "Catherine was born with kidney problems," Helen had explained, "but she's a fighter. She's doing great now." Catherine had nodded, but Steve caught her glancing at her watch, a nervous habit that seemed inconsistent with someone who was doing great. Now, 4 rounds into the game, that moment was about to explode into something that would transform everyone's understanding of what doing great really meant. The Morrison family was holding their own, tied with the Chen family heading into the final round. Steve was in his element, making jokes about Grandmother Morrison's surprisingly sassy answers and Uncle Paul's tendency to overthink every question. The category was things that bring families together. It was Catherine's turn at the podium. She had stepped forward with that same careful movement Steve had noticed earlier, like someone who was managing pain or fatigue. "All right, Catherine, things that bring families together, what do you think?" Catherine had gripped the podium, and Steve noticed her knuckles were white against the dark wood. "Health scares," she had answered, her voice strong despite everything. The answer was number 3 on the board, worth 14 points. The Morrison family celebrated, but Catherine hadn't moved from the microphone. She was staring at her mother with an expression that carried the weight of months of kept secrets. "Catherine," Steve had said, approaching the podium, "that's a pretty specific answer. You speaking from experience?" That's when it happened. Catherine looked directly at Steve, then at her mother, then back at Steve. When she spoke, her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a burden too heavy for one person. "Mr. Harvey, my mother saved my life 3 years ago by giving me one of her kidneys. But what she doesn't know is that my body has been rejecting it for the past 6 months." The studio audience gasped audibly. Helen's face went through a series of emotions so quickly it was like watching someone's world collapse in real time. "Catherine," Helen said, her voice shaking, "what are you saying?" Catherine's composure began to crack. "Mom, I'm back on dialysis, 3 times a week. The kidney you gave me is dying and there's nothing the doctors can do to save it." The words hit Helen like a physical blow. She reached out to steady herself against the podium, her maternal instincts warring with the shock of betrayal.
How long have you known?
Helen whispered. 6 months. The rejection started slowly, but it's gotten worse. I'm back on the transplant list, but the doctors say it could be years before another kidney becomes available. Steve Harvey had witnessed countless emotional moments over his career, but this was different. This was a daughter trying to protect her mother from the knowledge that her sacrifice was failing. Behind the scenes, a producer made a decision that would define this moment forever. Keep the cameras rolling. Let America witness the complexity of love and sacrifice. "Catherine," Steve said, his voice gentle but firm, "why didn't you tell your mother?" Catherine looked at Helen, tears now streaming down both of their faces. "Because she already gave me everything she could give. Because I couldn't bear to tell her that her kidney, the piece of herself she gave to save me, wasn't enough." Helen stepped closer to her daughter, and for a moment the television cameras, the studio audience, and the game show format ceased to matter. "Catherine Marie Morrison," Helen said, using the full name that every mother reserves for moments of absolute serious. "You look at me right now." Catherine met her mother's eyes. "Do you think I gave you that kidney so you could protect my feelings? Do you think I made that sarfa so you could suffer alone?" "Mom, I just..." "No," Helen interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "I gave you that kidney because you are my daughter, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing I wouldn't do to help you fight. If that kidney is failing, then we fight together. If you need another transplant, then we find another transplant." The studio audience was openly weeping now. This wasn't entertainment. This was witnessing the purest form of maternal love, the kind that refuses to accept defeat. But Helen wasn't finished. "And if you need another kidney, if the doctors will allow it, you can have my other one." The statement hung in the studio air like a declaration of war against death itself. Steve Harvey, who had made America laugh for decades, found himself completely speechless. This was love at its most fierce, most uncompromising. "Mrs. Morrison," Steve finally said, "you can't live without both kidneys." Helen looked at him with the kind of maternal intensity that could move mountains. "Mr. Harvey, I lived 59 years before Catherine was born. If giving her my remaining kidney means she gets to live 50 more years, then that's not a sacrifice. That's mathematics." Catherine collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing with a combination of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming love. "Mom, they won't let you do that. You're 62. They won't approve a second donation. Then we'll find another way," Helen said firmly. "We'll find a living donor. We'll raise money for the best treatment. We'll move mountains if we have to." That's when Steve Harvey did something that broke every rule of television production. He pulled out his cell phone and, without asking permission from anyone, started making calls. "What are you doing, Mr. Harvey?" Catherine asked. "I'm calling every transplant specialist I know. I'm calling treatment centers. I'm calling people who know PB, because your mother is right. We're going to find another way. The first call was to Dr. Patricia Williams at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. Steve explained the situation, described Catherine's condition, and asked about living donor options. The conversation lasted several minutes, with Steve taking notes on the back of his game cards. The second call was to his own foundation's medical advisory board, a network of physicians who helped connect people with Phyllis care. Dr. Martinez, this is Steve Harvey. I have a young woman here who needs a kidney transplant. I need you to activate every contact we have. With each phone call, the studio audience grew quieter, more focused. They were witnessing something unprecedented, a television host using his platform and connections to potentially save a life. But Steve wasn't done. After the fourth call, he turned to the studio audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to understand what we're witnessing here. This young woman has been fissing in silence to protect her mother's feelings. This mother is willing to give her life to save her daughter. This is what love looks like when it refuses to give up. But the response was immediate and overwhelming. Audience members began shouting offers of help, medical contacts, fundraising support, prayers. But what happened next was unprecedented. A woman in the third row stood up and called out, "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen from Sacramento. I'm a nephrologist and I'd like to examine Catherine if she's willing." Dr. Chen, who had been in the audience as part of the competing Chen family, stepped forward with her medical bag. "Catherine, I can't promise anything, but I can give you a preliminary examination and connect you with some colleagues who specialize in transplant rejection." Within minutes, the Family Feud studio had been transformed into an impromptu medical consultation room. Dr. Chen examined Catherine's dialysis access port, reviewed her recent lab results on her phone, and made several calls to colleagues across the country. "Catherine," Dr. Chen said after her examination, "your situation is serious, but it's not hopeless. There are new anti-rejection protocols we can try, and if those don't work, there are several promising living donor programs." But the most powerful moment came when Dr. Chen turned to address the studio audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, kidney disease affects millions of Americans. Most people can live normal, healthy lives with one kidney. If anyone here is interested in learning about becoming a living donor, not necessarily for Catherine, but for the thousands of people on waiting lists, I can provide information." The response was immediate. More than 50 audience members raised their hands, expressing interest in donor testing. Steve Harvey looked around the studio at Catherine and Helen holding each other, at Dr. Chen coordinating medical consultations, at dozens of strangers offering to potentially save lives. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this is what happens when people choose love over fear, action over inaction, hope over despair." The episode, when it aired 6 weeks later, became a catalyst for the largest single-day increase in kidney donor registrations in American history. The National Kidney Foundation reported over 10,000 new donor registrations within 24 hours of the episode airing. But perhaps most importantly, Catherine's story sparked a national conversation about the hidden struggles of transplant patients and the ongoing need for organ donors. Catherine herself received over 200 offers from potential living donors. After extensive medical and psychological screening, she received a new kidney from Maria Santos, a 34-year-old teacher from Phoenix who had been inspired by the episode. The transplant was successful, and Catherine's body accepted the new kidney without complications. 6 months later, Catherine and Maria appeared together on Steve Harvey's talk show, not as patient and donor, but as friends whose lives had been forever connected by an act of extraordinary generosity. Helen Morrison became a spokesperson for organ donation awareness, traveling the country to share her family's story and encourage others to consider donation. But perhaps the most profound change was in the relationship between Catherine and Helen. The forced honesty of that moment on television had broken down barriers that had existed for years. Catherine learned that protecting her mother from difficult truths wasn't actually protecting her at all. Helen learned that her daughter's independence didn't mean she had to face everything alone. Steve Harvey learned something that day that changed how he approaches every person who steps onto his stage. He learned that sometimes the most important question isn't the one written on the game card. Sometimes it's the follow-up question, the one that comes from genuinely caring about the person in front of you. The kidney that Helen had given Catherine 3 years earlier eventually failed completely, but by then Catherine had received her new kidney and was thriving. Helen often jokes that she got 2 daughters from that one kidney, Catherine and Maria, who has become like a second daughter to her. The borrowed life became a saved life, not through one person's sacrifice, but through an entire community's decision to care. Steve Harvey still keeps a photo on his desk from Catherine's second transplant surgery. It shows Catherine, Helen, and Maria all holding hands in the hospital room, smiling despite the medical equipment surrounding them. The note attached reads, "Mr. Harvey, thank you for teaching us that love shared is love multiplied. The borrowed life became a gift that keeps giving, because sometimes asking the right question at the right moment can save a life. Sometimes transparency is the most powerful medicine. And sometimes a game show can become the beginning of a miracle that extends far beyond television. That's not just good entertainment. That's the power of human connection to transform tragedy into hope, secrets into strength, and one family's struggle into a community's triumph. Because love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it multiplies. And that's a lesson worth more than any game show prize could ever offer.